Peter B. Collins, news and comments. It's Wednesday, May 13th, 2020. The shoes are dropping in Washington, D.C. as the Obamagate counter-narrative surfaces, as Trump feverishly tries to change the subject from his bungled handling of the pandemic. Now, we must consider the big picture here. Yesterday, I shared with you our in-depth interview with Scott Ritter. We talked about the Flynn case. He changed my mind, as I discussed with you yesterday. And one of the things we talked about is the unmasking of Mike Flynn in that intercepted phone call with the Russian ambassador around Christmas in 2016. And in my headline yesterday, I warned that Obamagate is on the way, Russiagate is seriously unraveling. Now, these releases are not accidental in my view, and I want to stress that. You've got Bill Barr, who dropped one shoe in the Mike Flynn, his attempt to withdraw the charges and cause that case to collapse. We have an update on that coming up shortly. Then you have this guy, Ric Grenell. He's nominally the ambassador to Germany. He is a Trump loyalist who has been installed, we were told, for just a few weeks as the Director of National Intelligence. And they have another Trump loyalist that they're trying to get confirmed in the Senate right now. But Ric Grenell has authorized the declassification of a list of Obama administration figures who, starting in November of 2016, after Obama had warned Trump not to hire Mike Flynn as his national security advisor, they began a series of requests to the National Security Agency, which handles all of the wiretapping, the eavesdropping, the surveillance, to unmask these conversations that revealed that Mike Flynn was the U.S. person in the nomenclature of the law, who had been talking with the Russian ambassador and perhaps other people. Now, the list includes not only top Obama administration officials, but some military people and peripheral figures who are said to have all sought to unmask conversations with Mike Flynn, including generals in the Middle East. And that's not particularly relevant. But the list of people in the Obama White House, at the FBI, James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, John Brennan, who was the Director of the CIA. Now, some of the requests came before the Kislyak phone call. For example, Samantha Power, UN ambassador, she made unmasking requests, and according to the document, these are all related to Flynn, 7 times between November 30th and January 11th. Again, the critical call was on December 25th. Clapper made 3 requests December 2nd, 2016 through January 7th. So January 5th was a White House meeting. January 7th was the day they went to Trump Tower. And Comey was the one selected to tell him about the Steele dossier and the P-tape. John Brennan made 2 requests December 14 and December 15th. Those, again, were prior to the phone call that came into focus. And James Comey's request was also on December 15th. White House Chief of Staff Dennis McDonough made a request on January 5th. That was the day of the Oval Office meeting. And on January 12th, the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party, then Vice President Joe Biden, made a request. So the Oval Office meeting on January 5th included Obama, Biden, Clapper, Brennan, Comey, National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and Attorney General Sally Yates. And Yates later told interviewers, I think for the special counsel, that she only learned in that meeting about the Flynn-Kislyak phone call. Now, there may have been earlier phone calls with Kislyak. There are many details here that we do not know. But this is truly damaging information that essentially gives you a list of the potential conspirators on what is shaping up as Obamagate. And it propelled forward as the emerging Russiagate scandal. Russia meddled in the 2016 election to favor Trump. January 7th was the day that the Brennan and Clapper assessment, where they used all those weasel words to say, we assess that Russia interfered, we assess that they hacked the DNC, we assess that they gave that to WikiLeaks. Well, we now know that those assessments were concocted because CrowdStrike and Sean Henry told the House Intelligence Committee in 2017 and 2018 that they still didn't have any evidence. They believed it to be, but they couldn't prove it. And yet we were told through the assessments, through the later television interviews with Rachel Maddow and all the anchors at CNN, the hyper coverage of the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Mueller report, which declared systemic interference by Russia in the 2016 election. Well, what kind of systems are based on false claims or unproven claims? So today, this story is being reported by Fox, air quotes, News, and by the Washington Post, which ran a rather dry recitation of how Ric Grenell handed these documents off to Senators Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson, who have made the documents public. They didn't raise any particular context, and of course they didn't connect it to the unraveling Russiagate narrative. Like the Times, the Post has a huge investment in that, and I believe their credibility will suffer a hit like we have never seen before, and that Trump will exploit that with his fake news claims. And as I said at the beginning, these are not accidental releases. This is part of strategery, as George W. Bush would say. And it's an effort to resuscitate Trump's poll numbers before it gets too late, to distract. And I just criticized other people yesterday for speculating on what kind of things Trump is trying to distract us from. But I feel pretty safe in my speculation that he wants to change the subject. Sure, people are dying. This effort to reopen the economy appears to be premature. And he wants something else to occupy his Twitterverse. And this is the red meat, the crack cocaine that feeds his base. And I just want to note that, once again, I mean, my universe of people on Facebook is a pretty small sample. But there's several of these Democrats who are mocking Trump for refusing to define what he means by Obamagate. They're mocking the whole concept that Obama could have presided over anything like this. And even if some of my suppositions and my connecting of dots proves to be a little bit off, Russiagate is over. The media will either eat crow or just ignore it, and they will become sitting ducks for Trump and his allies. So Judge Emmett Sullivan, who has to approve the Justice Department request to dismiss the charges against former General Mike Flynn, he did something unexpected. he has set a schedule for outside parties to present arguments about the government's request to dismiss the case. He did not directly address the department's motion to drop the charges, but legal experts said he appeared open to considering not only the department's arguments but also those who challenged its move as politically motivated. So this is going to go into extra innings at a time when there is no baseball. And in the voice of Sharon Lafreniere at the New York Times, Judge Sullivan has some limited discretion to decide whether to accept the Justice Department's decision to abandon the case. I think it's a little bit more than that. I think there's a lot of airing out, different hearings, submissions from what are called amicus curiae, friends of the court. And, of course, Flynn's legal team is steaming mad. They've objected to this decision. They claim that the court really only can listen to the Justice Department and the defense. They argue this court has consistently, on 24 previous occasions, summarily refused to permit any third party to inject themselves or their views into this case. So what? The judge has the gavel, and he's going to have the final say. And as Scott Ritter persuaded me, the fundamental legal basis of opening the original counterintelligence case called Crossfire Razor to study Mike Flynn in the summer of 2016, well, it was stretched, probably beyond legal limits, to give new life when the intercept of this phone call was fully unmasked. And it's hard to dismiss the political implications and the counter-narrative that credibly surfaces as a result and with the unmasking. And, of course, we're all masked now, right? With various kinds of face coverings. But this is the kind of unmasking that can give you more than a whiff of coronavirus. So people like Comey, Clapper and Brennan, who I consider to be the prime movers in the Russiagate narrative, I think they're all going to be lawyering up in the very near future. And who knows what vindication Trump will seek with his personal counsel installed as Attorney General, one Billy Barr. So this is going to be ugly. This is going to be a smackdown to the finish. And I believe that this is one of those things where Trump has managed to keep his own counsel and not spring this too early. And while he still plans to hold a Republican convention, the Democrats have moved to take it into the back rooms with some Zooms and simply crown Joe Biden their nominee. And there'll be the ritual of naming a vice president that he has already selected. So I think that this is going to be a huge, rude awakening for so many people who have been so invested in this scandal, in the whole meme that Russia shifted the election, that the trivial efforts of the Internet Research Agency run by Putin's chef in St. Petersburg, it's mostly a troll farm. And as I've said, I believe that Russia hacks us or attempts to hack the United States every day, and we do the same to them. But the fundamental claim that Russian agents of the GRU, as delineated in Bob Mueller's tediously detailed indictment that's going absolutely nowhere, well, that appears to be fiction. And when you pull these threads, I'm running out of metaphors, but the whole house of cards does collapse. And I want to take just one moment here to commend two editors at Consortium News, the late Robert Perry who was an early skeptic of Russiagate, died after a stroke during the holidays of 2018. A man I interviewed countless times, and I always respected his critical views and the way he stuck to real evidence. And he was succeeded by my pal Joe Lauria, a longtime United Nations correspondent, a very solid shoe leather reporter. And Consortium News deserves a victory lap, a credit for what they've done. And I've put up a link to an article that Lauria posted today, and it includes a pitch to contribute to their spring fundraiser, their 25th anniversary drive. And if you've got the coin and you're so inclined, I hope you'll put some money in their account. Curious pieces at the New York Times today. This one's called A News Story, and it airs out all kinds of weaknesses about Joe Biden and how Democrats who don't want to be named are worried. And, spoiler alert, it doesn't mention anything that I've just told you about. Oh, yeah, they finally begrudgingly talk about Tara Reade as they tiptoe around the allegations that she's made and what damage that's already done to Biden's candidacy. They criticize him for his slow response to the sexual assault allegation. And they talk about some of the hits that Trump has taken about China. Do they mention Ukraine? Well, they just mention Hunter. They don't talk specifically about the whole Ukraine narrative, which will be back, but it'll take second place, a back seat, to Obamagate. And as news breaks that Mike Bloomberg is going to drop another $100 million in ads attacking Trump, I've seen that all kinds of people, starting with Jeb Bush 4 years ago, thought that you could run negative ads and expose Donald Trump and that it would change the minds of his voters. I don't think so. The other piece is an opinion column at the New York Times under the byline of Mitchell Abador, the editor and translator of Down with the Law, anarchist individualist writings from early 20th century France. And he goes after the young leftists who are squirming as their elders tell them to sit down, shut up, suck it up, and vote for Joe Biden. And here he opens by citing that public letter that was published last month in The Nation, where a group of 1960s radicals like Todd Gitlin and others very gently said, hey, look, back in the 60s, we were purist, we had a moral backbone, and we wouldn't support Hubert Humphrey when he challenged Richard Nixon in 1968. And I actually met Humphrey, I think I was 15. He made a campaign stop in Cincinnati. My dad paid to go to the fundraiser. And I was kept in the kitchen. But Humphrey, in order to get to his car with his Secret Service agent, had to go through the kitchen. And he was nice enough to stop and talk to me for a couple of minutes. I was kind of knocked over. But Hubert Humphrey was 1968's predecessor to Joe Biden in 2020. A candidate wounded by the legacy of his predecessor. In Humphrey's case, it was LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. And here Joe Biden carries so much baggage, it's not just one predecessor. But it amazes me how this column essentially says that these young Democrats who've had a taste of socialism because of Bernie Sanders need to straighten up and recognize the sinister threat posed by Trump and just vote for Joe Biden. And I refuse to lecture any American about how they should vote. As you know, I think Biden is a terrible candidate. And I have plenty of pragmatic friends who are more left than most Democrats who are going to say, look, it's not too hard. I can't stand another 4 years of Trump, and Biden is a least objectionable option or less objectionable option. At the same time, I respect people who choose not to throw away their vote on somebody they think is likely to lose and who, at this point, is still refusing to even tilt toward Medicare for all, despite the pandemic, and who simply doesn't represent their interests. Nobody has to vote the way you think or you may think they should. Troubling development on the front page of the Los Angeles Times today. A woman named Janice Brown in Victorville. That's about an hour east of Los Angeles, out in the desert. It's where the Roy Rogers Museum is, and they play Happy Trails all the time, just like me. But Janice Brown is in her 60s. She's 66. She was the first patient at the Desert Valley Hospital to test positive for the coronavirus. And then she got over it. And she was released. And now Janice Brown is back at the very same hospital on her second case of COVID-19. Now, this sends some chills because while Dr. Fauci, who's demonized by many, he has carefully said that we don't have proof that if you get it once, you can't get it again. And the various antibody tests, many of which have very high false positive rates, that are being used to try to indicate that people have already had it so they don't have to worry about getting it again. Well, this is only one case. And I am not a scientist or a data expert, so I'm not going to extrapolate from it. My job is to give you the news and offer you some comment. I also want you to follow the link if you're at all curious about the pattern of infection rates, positive testing, hospitalizations, and deaths in California. The Fresno Bee and its sister publication, the Sacramento Bee, put together a great interactive graph. And I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast. And it shows you county by county the pattern across California. So it's Los Angeles and 4 other counties that show up red in this graph. They have the highest rates of infection, hospitalization, and L.A. has had more than half of the deaths recorded linked to the coronavirus here in California to date. But there are 26 counties that currently show only a handful of cases, only a handful of hospitalizations, and no recent reports of recorded deaths. There are 58 counties total in California, and this produces great sympathy from me about what Governor Gavin, the Gavinator, Newsom faces. Because the natives are restless in the states where they don't see a problem. They don't see a high level of risk. And yet, if we relax at this point, he fears that the virus will travel into these areas that are currently more or less in the clear. It's a Hobson's choice, and I wouldn't want to be in the position to have to make it. I also want to commend the California legislature. They're considering some really drastic measures. One is that they want to ask Californians to prepay their state income tax. They'll give you a little break and brownie points. I would do that if they promised me no audits for the rest of my life. I don't think that is under consideration. But we're facing a $54 billion deficit. There's, $20 billion or so in various accounts, rainy day fund, and a surplus from last year. But they are scrambling. And, of course, I think it will inevitably lead to some tax increases. But to their credit, they are talking about giving relief to renters and to landlords by allowing the renters who have to defer their rent for, the language right now is up to 7 months, would be able to pay that back over a 10-year period. And essentially, the state would give tax credits to landlords that are roughly similar to the amounts being deferred by their renters. Now, I think this is a very innovative scheme. I haven't seen all the details. I don't know if it can pass. But my heart is warmed that they're thinking about these kinds of proposals and willing to take that kind of risk on behalf of the people who already suffer from incredibly high rents, many of whom are unemployed and will be for some time. And also, we've got to take into account that not all landlords are corporate snakes like the Kushner Company, for example. I know people who own one apartment building with 10 units. I know people who have 3 homes that they rent to people. It's part of their whole investment portfolio. And how long can they hold out if people can't afford to pay the rent without booting them and finding somebody who does or who can? So we'll see how all of that gets ironed out. Yesterday, I reported and gave you some insight from a great critical piece at The Intercept about how the fact that Congress has not been in session, the House at least, has given excessive power to Nancy Pelosi and allowed her to essentially speak for the entire Democratic majority in the House in negotiations with the Senate. And as a result, we've had some legislation that is clearly not as progressive as it could have been. So Steny Hoyer, Pelosi's number 2 in the House, has a proposal to allow proxy voting. Essentially, members who cannot be there in person can signal their vote up to 10 proxies to one member who is present. They have to submit in writing what their vote is, but I think that all makes sense. And he also wants to use hybrid hearings where some people attend in person and some people Zoom in. I'm also fine with that. And I think it would restore the appropriate balance of power in favor of more progressive elements of the party. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support me here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. And starting in mid-April, we opened up the PBC Podcast Community Fund. And I'm pleased to say that through the generosity of my regular subscribers and many people who've chosen to add additional money, that we are funded. Today, once again, I do not have any requests for a $100 grant. And so I renew my invitation. If you've hit the skids, you're having trouble buying groceries, meeting your daily requirements, or you're looking at 2 weeks from now, you've got to pay the rent and you haven't been paid in a while, don't be shy. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com. And just give me a paragraph or so about your situation that you're willing to let me share with our listeners, and I will either send you an immediate transfer via PayPal or put a check in the mail to you the same day that I honor your request. Again, my email, peter at peterbcollins.com. Now to our daily coronavirus report, edited by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, the report is just under 300,000 deaths linked to COVID-19. Here in the United States, it's 83,650. And Linda follows up on the $3 trillion coronavirus relief package announced by Democrats on Tuesday, and they're going to try to pass it in the House on Friday. Now, there is squirming from progressives who are calling for a delay to discuss and add to the bill. But even if all the members were to show up, and that's not likely, Pelosi can pass it with as many as 17 Democratic no votes. And once again, The Intercept offers some really good criticism of this package. It's been noted by others that the language was altered to include bailouts for lobbyists. Now, not all lobbyists are bad, and they're not all located on K Street. But I am concerned about the details in that part of the package. And the Intercept writers, Kella Lacey and John Walker, zero in on the efforts to bail out people who've lost their jobs and who are now buying health insurance through their employer under the COBRA Act. And I don't know if you've ever been on COBRA, but boy, is it expensive. It is coverage, and, you want to maintain coverage at all costs, but it can be really steep. But in the language, the COBRA protection will benefit healthcare companies like United Health, Humana, Cigna, who have reported profits during the pandemic, despite the record-high unemployment levels. They're boasting they don't expect to take a financial hit. So the second-largest health insurance lobby met with the Blue Dog Caucus. That was in mid-April. They discussed the importance of protecting the employer-sponsored plans. Now, of course, these are the very ones that would be out of business if we were on track to Medicare for all. We know Pelosi didn't support Medicare for all. Many Democrats don't. And so instead, they are jumping into the arms of the for-profit health insurance industry that they can count on to shower them with campaign contributions into the foreseeable future. And so this article, I think, does a good job of describing how what on the surface is intended to benefit workers who've lost their employer coverage, but it is a big sop to the for-profit health insurance companies. Back to Linda's report, Social Security recipients are expected to get stimulus checks, the $1,200 or up to $1,200, starting today. If you have direct deposit, it's supposed to be happening as I speak, and if it's coming to you in the mail, it could be starting as soon as today, but expected to drop in large part by the end of this week. And you've heard about Rick Bright. He's going to be testifying before a House subcommittee tomorrow. He is the whistleblowing virologist removed from his job over at HHS as director of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. He's got some whistles to blow, and he doesn't seem to be afraid to lean into them big time. Here's an advance quote from his statement. As I reflect on the past few months of this outbreak, it's painfully clear that we were not as prepared as we should have been. We missed early warning signals. We forgot important pages from our pandemic playbook. There will be plenty of time to identify gaps for improvement. For now, we need to focus on getting things right going forward. We need to ensure that we have a plan to recovery and that everyone knows the plan and participates in it. And he'll be on 60 Minutes for a heavily edited interview this Sunday. Every whistleblower I've known who's gone on 60 Minutes, half of their story was left on the cutting room floor. Oh, they act tough and like they go deep, but it's largely a televised illusion. Mark Cuban, the owner of the the Dallas Mavericks, you know what I'm trying to say, the billionaire entrepreneur, says the nation needs the same coronavirus safeguards currently available to the White House before most Americans will be comfortable going out again, much less to an NBA game with 10,000 or 30,000 people. We have to get to that point where the White House standard becomes the national standard, I think, in order for consumers to feel safe going out, in order for employers to feel completely safe bringing people back to work. So the market tanked today 500 points last time I looked, after the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, appointed by Trump and sniped at ever since, he kind of echoed the health experts who testified remotely to the Senate committee yesterday. He delivered a stark warning that the U.S. is facing an economic hit without modern precedent, that could permanently damage the economy if Congress doesn't provide enough policy support, and I would say cash, to prevent a wave of bankruptcies and prolonged joblessness. His blunt diagnosis, the clearest signal yet that the trillions of dollars that they've already funneled into the economy may not be enough. And it serves as a rejoinder to lawmakers and the people on the Republican side who suddenly are concerned about the deficit. Now that we're not bailing out companies, we're bailing out people and state governments and things like that. So I appreciate Powell's comments. He may be banished into one of those border cages with Anthony Fauci if he doesn't watch out. Also, we know that special favors are being done for Trump's cronies. The latest, Paul Manafort, the convicted former campaign chairman, was released from prison today. He's going to be suffering under home confinement in Northern Virginia because of concerns over the coronavirus. Michael Cohen is still behind bars. He's been told he can go home, but it hasn't happened. And meanwhile, there are tens of thousands of federal prisoners who are boxed up in these dangerous prisons where we are seeing the death count rise. And most of all, mostly people just don't care. This is the ultimate form of locking them up and throwing away the key. Governor Cuomo of New York said today that there are now as many as 102 cases of this linkage between Kawasaki syndrome and positive testing for COVID-19. In New York State, 71% of them resulted in children being admitted to intensive care. 43% remain hospitalized. And while Trump continues to force slaughterhouse workers to continue operations despite huge outbreaks of coronavirus and many reported deaths, he's not too concerned about the people who can't get an adequate supply of food at the moment because they can't afford it, primarily. And the special waivers that include the possibility for SNAP recipients to have food delivered to their homes, the extension of school breakfast and lunch programs that temporarily were untethered from the delivery of the food at school. These are all about to expire at the end of the month. And we'll see if there's a will to extend them. Trump and Stephen Miller, who was correctly described in a New York Times column by Maureen Dowd as a racist on Sunday, they have essentially shut down the legal right to request asylum in the United States by people who travel to our border. Of course, this is the southern border. The restrictions have become so tight that only 2 people seeking asylum since March 21st have been allowed to stay in the United States, while 20,000 have been expelled or deported in one form or another. Stats show that the customs people conducted just 59 screening interviews between March 21st and May 13th. Effectively, the only way for people to get that kind of relief. Out of those 59, 54 were rejected. 3 cases are pending. Crown Prince Jared Kushner caused a stir yesterday when he said he couldn't be sure if the election in November will go on the date and time as planned. He made remarks to Time magazine and then walked it back, saying he was not involved in any discussions about changing the date of the 2020 election. And Trump has said that he's not planning to do that, but you can never believe that guy. So what he did say was, I'm not sure I can commit one way or the other, but right now, that's the plan, November 3rd. Hopefully, by the time we get to September, October, November, we've done enough work with testing and with all the different things we're trying to do to prevent a future outbreak of the magnitude that would make us shut down again. I really believe that once America opens up, it'll be very hard for America to ever lock down again. And, of course, implicit in that is that the people in nursing homes, the African Americans, and the Latino population that are taking the biggest brunt in the fatalities related to coronavirus, well, they don't matter to Jared Kushner. I want to recommend a piece over at Who, What, Why. Gabriella Novello points out that because so many states are moving to voting by mail, that there will be no result on the night of November 3rd, even if Kushner allows it to go forward. And that is because you can't count them that fast. Now, while there are some risks to mail-in voting, I'm persuaded that this is the best route to take at this time. We basically have to guard against the harvesting of absentee ballots by Republicans, like they did in North Carolina, where they got caught. That is election fraud. But we'll be diverted into looking for, odd instances of voter fraud. And I'll also note that there were special elections yesterday, one in Southern California, one in Wisconsin. And because of the heavy use of absentee ballots, we won't know the result for a couple of weeks. And I did see a story that the Southern California race is tilting to the Republicans. But I'll wait and see what the final count is. And the other benefit of voting by mail is that there are what we can call paper ballots. And while many of them will be scanned initially, if there are issues, those are physical ballots that can be audited and examined after the fact. And that gives us just a little more trust in a system that has been gamed repeatedly and repeatedly. Back in 2016, I argued in favor of releasing people who were designated as members of the Electoral College from any requirement that they vote based on what the underlying voters who made them electors, what the majority voted for. And today, I haven't seen any details, but they had the remote oral arguments of the United States Supreme Court in the case of a Washington state man, Brett Chiafalo. He was one of 7 so-called faithless electors. And he wanted to stop Donald Trump using what I think the Electoral College was intended for. Because if you look at the writings of the Founding Fathers, they didn't trust direct democracy. They feared that the rabble could be rounded up by a scallywag. That's my term. And this was a way to prevent the rise of a dangerous populist. And so the Democrats made no effort to use the Electoral College for, as I say, its historical intended purpose, and instead would not release electors. There were moves here in California. And so the court will hear the arguments and rule on that sometime at the end of this term, which may extend beyond the end of June. We're not really clear on that right now. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that Maureen Dowd in the New York Times called Stephen Miller a racist. I think that's accurate, and she is an opinion writer, so they give her that kind of latitude. But science writer and health reporter Don McNeil Jr., who's been on television quite a bit, and he's a straight shooter in my view, he has been spanked by the Gray Lady because in an interview with Christiane Amanpour at CNN, here's what he said. "We completely blew it for the first 2 months of our response. We were in a headless chicken phase, and yes, it's the president's fault. It's not China's fault. The head of the Chinese CDC was on the phone to Robert Redfield, our CDC guy, on January 1st, January 8th, and the two agencies were talking again on January 19th. The Chinese had a test on Jan 13, the Germans Jan 16. We fiddled around for 2 months. We had a test March 5th, and it didn't work. We didn't have 10,000 people tested until March 15th. So we lost 2 months there, and that was because of incompetent leadership at the CDC. It's incompetently led, and I think Dr. Redfield should resign. And there was suppression from the top. I mean, the real cover-up was the person in this country who was saying, this is not an important virus, the flu is worse, it's all going to go away, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing. I had the same problem at the Times. I was trying to convince my editors. This is really bad. This is a pandemic. It took a while to get to them. It took a while to get anybody to believe this. Getting rid of Alex Azar was a mistake. He was actually leading a dramatic response. And then in February, he was replaced with Mike Pence, who is a sycophant. So the offending part of McNeil's quote there is that he stated the obvious. He called Mike Pence a sycophant. And that offends the standards of the New York Times. Standards that they're not living up to on the story that we have revealed over the past week about Israeli interference on a covert basis, meddling in the 2016 campaign. No, they haven't sought fit to share that with us, even though they were one of the parties who got it declassified. And likewise, the New York Times is so far ignoring the list of people who requested unmasking that we led with on the podcast today. And finally, I'll note that I tried to get in touch with Scott Shane. He apparently was, I'll put it in past tense, a national security reporter at the Times. I interviewed him a few times over the years. And so I tried to email him today. I wanted to get his comments on the latest revelations that undermine the reporting that he and his colleagues did on Russiagate. And I had 2 different emails for Scott Shane at the New York Times. Both of them bounced. So apparently he is a former New York Times national security reporter. I want to recommend a great interview. Ford Green tipped me off to this. It's over at Alternet. I don't browse there too often. But the reporter in this case, let's find the name, decided to interview my buddy, Dr. Justin A. Frank, the Washington psychiatrist and the author of Trump on the Couch, Obama on the Couch, Bush on the Couch. And if you haven't heard it, we did an interview 5 or 6 weeks ago now that is still quite relevant. His analysis of Trump, I think, is spot on. So here, Alternet picked up this piece from Salon. It is credited to Chauncey De Vega, and he rang up Dr. Frank and conducted a lengthy interview with him. And I'll just pull one piece because it's fresh in your minds, the way that Trump on Monday denigrated the Chinese-American reporter, I think her name is Jiang from CBS News, and then, just ignored and dismissed a female reporter from CNN. And Dr. Frank is quoted here saying, Trump loves sparring with the reporters who are women. For Trump, being combative with them is a kind of aggressive fighting and jousting. It is very sexual for Trump on an unconscious level. He is aroused by female reporters who stand up to him. It's a great turn-on for Trump. Conflict in general is a turn-on, arousing for Trump, but conflict with a woman is even more exciting. Trump has a fantasy of dominating these women. I also think that Donald Trump has a deep or perhaps passive or latent desire to be dominated by a confident, strong woman. Donald Trump has a very complicated relationship with women where he likes to fight with them, but also wants them to be subservient to him. So I think that's an interesting quote. Check out the whole piece. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. And finally, I don't know either of these guys. One is a blogger who calls his blog Journal of a Grumpy Old Man. His email handle is Cumming42. And he cites Nate White, a British writer who I'm not familiar with. But none of that matters because here's what Nate White has to say about Donald Trump. A few things spring to mind. Trump lacks certain qualities which the British traditionally esteem. For instance, he has no class, no charm, no coolness, no credibility, no compassion, no wit, no warmth, no wisdom, no subtlety, no sensitivity, no self-awareness, no humility, no honor, and no grace. All qualities, funnily enough, with which his predecessor, Obama, was generously blessed. Plus, we like a laugh, and while Trump may be laughable, he has never once said anything wry, witty, or even faintly amusing. Not once, ever. And that fact is particularly disturbing to the British sensibility. For us, to lack humor is almost inhuman. But with Trump, it's a fact. He doesn't even seem to understand what a joke is. His idea of a joke is a crass comment, an illiterate insult, a casual act of cruelty. And one more paragraph here. Trump is a troll, and like all trolls, he is never funny, he never laughs, he only crows or jeers. And scarily, he doesn't just talk in crude, witless insults, he actually thinks in them. His mind is a simple bot-like algorithm of petty prejudices and knee-jerk nastiness. Well, thank you. That made my day. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.